Women don't even know how to treat men because they were never taught how. Boys grew up being trained from day one. Be a gentleman, open the door, protect her, provide for her, be understanding. And if she hits you, you don't hit her back. Everywhere we looked, the message was the same. Movies, books, fairy tales. The man rescues the woman. The man saves the day. The man risks his life. The man carries the burden. And women were always the princesses, right? But there's a problem with that. We never saw the reverse. We never saw stories about how women should be treating men. No novels teaching girls how to respect a man. No movies demonstrating feminine loyalty, softness, or devotion. Parents don't even teach it. School doesn't even teach it. And society definitely doesn't teach that. So guess what happens? We have generations of women who expect everything, but were never taught to give anything back. And feminism made it worse. Instead of teaching women how to understand men, how to work in synergy, how to create polarity, it taught them to compete with the men, to fight with them, to become a man, to see softness as weakness and masculinity as toxic.
There is a shift happening right now that most people feel, but very few are willing to talk about honestly. It is not loud, it is not dramatic, and it is not being led by protest or marches. It is quiet, deliberate, and irreversible. Millions of men are stepping back from society, from dating, from traditional expectations, and from systems that no longer reward their effort. And now, after decades of pressure, accusation, and denial, society is starting to ask a very uncomfortable question. Why are so many men walking away? And who pushed them there? Stay with me to the very end of this video, because the answer is not what you are being told. And once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it. Before we get into this, make sure you like the video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all if you want more great Angry Guy content and you want every single video the moment we release it. That support matters more than you think. And if you are serious about protecting yourself in an unstable world, make sure you check out Angry's Crypto Academy. It is linked in the description of this video. That is where you learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth by learning how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly and intelligently. Go check it out now. And if you're enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show direct support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It keeps the lights on and the content flowing. Now, let us talk honestly. For years, men were told to change. Then they changed. Men were told to be quieter, softer, less assertive, less confident, less masculine. Men were told their instincts were wrong, their boundaries were offensive, and their presence was a problem. Men were told they were not needed, not wanted, and not valued unless they provided something tangible in return. And for a long time, they listened. They adapted. They tried to meet expectations that kept shifting further out of reach. Eventually, they noticed something critical. No matter how much they adjusted, the accusations did not stop. The goalposts kept moving, and the rewards disappeared. This did not happen overnight. This was not one moment or one event. This was decades of pressure building layer by layer. Cultural narratives taught men that their natural behavior was something to be corrected rather than understood. Boys grew up hearing that masculinity itself was a flaw that needed supervision. Men entered adulthood already defensive, already cautious, already unsure whether being themselves would cost them their reputation, their career, or their freedom. At the same time, the social contract quietly changed. Relationships became transactional. Effort was expected in one direction, while appreciation became conditional or non existent. Men were told to pursue, to pay, to provide, to protect, and to perform, while being reminded constantly that they were replaceable and lucky to be tolerated. When men questioned this imbalance, they were told they were entitled for expecting reciprocity. Public spaces became minefields. A glance could be misinterpreted. A conversation could be reframed. A moment could be recorded, clipped, and shared without context. Men learned that silence was safer than engagement, distance was safer than interest, and withdrawal was safer than participation. Not because men are fragile, but because rational people adjust behavior when risk outweighs reward. The legal environment reinforced this lesson. Men watched peers lose access to their children through systems that claimed neutrality while producing predictable outcomes. They watched wealth extracted long after relationships ended. They watched accusations alone carry consequences, even when evidence did not follow. The message was clear, even if it was never spoken directly. Participation carried asymmetric risk. Social narratives celebrated independence while still demanding provision. Men were told they were no longer required, yet were criticized when they stopped offering what they had been told was no longer needed. That contradiction matters. You cannot tell a group they are unnecessary and then panic when they believe you. What we are witnessing now is not rebellion, it is resignation. Men did not leave in anger, they left after acceptance. They did not storm out. They quietly closed the door behind them and redirected their energy elsewhere, into work, into hobbies, into personal peace, into financial stability, into solitude that feels calm instead of lonely. Here is the part that many people do not want to confront. Being alone is not the same as feeling alone. Once men learned the difference, everything changed. Peace replaced tension. Predictability replaced chaos. Self respect replaced approval seeking. Men realized they did not need to constantly audition for acceptance. They realized they could live simpler, quieter lives without constant scrutiny or performance. Minimalism was not a trend for men, it was a relief. Fewer obligations, fewer expectations, fewer risks. Men began removing what did not serve them. They kept what brought value, calm, and meaning. This is why many men walking away are not miserable. They are rested. They are focused. They are financially cautious. They are emotionally regulated. They are no longer chasing validation that was never guaranteed in the first place. Now, here's where the narrative flips. As more men disengaged, the systems that depended on their participation started to strain. Dating markets shifted. Social dynamics changed. Economic pressures became more visible. Suddenly, voices that once dismissed men as unnecessary began asking where the men went. Content appeared expressing confusion, frustration, and concern. Some asked politely, others demanded compliance. Very few acknowledged cause and effect. Instead of introspection, blame followed. Men were labeled avoidant, immature, or selfish for opting out. The same society that encouraged them to step aside now criticized them for doing exactly that. This is not accountability, this is denial. Men did not walk away because they hate women. Men walked away because the cost benefit calculation no longer made sense. That is not ideology, that is pattern recognition. When effort leads to loss, risk leads to punishment, and compliance leads to contempt, disengagement becomes logical. And this is where observable reality matters more than slogans. Men noticed that rules were enforced selectively. They noticed that accountability was one directional. They noticed that chaos was excused when it benefited certain narratives. They noticed that stability was expected from them, but not guaranteed in return. Once men trust what they see over what they are told, behavior changes permanently. This shift is not about anger, it is about clarity. Men realize that peace is valuable, predictability is valuable, autonomy is valuable. Men realize that they could design lives that did not revolve around constant negotiation of boundaries. Men realize they could invest in themselves instead of pouring effort into systems that offered diminishing returns. This is why calls for men to return to dating, to providing, to pursuing are increasingly ineffective. You cannot shame someone back into a system they escaped for their sanity. You cannot guilt someone into sacrificing peace once they have experienced it. You cannot threaten someone who no longer seeks approval from the source of the threat. The uncomfortable truth is that many men are thriving quietly. They are saving money instead of spending it to impress. They are resting instead of performing. They are planning instead of reacting. They are focused on self preservation rather than constant accommodation. And when men thrive without needing permission, it disrupts narratives built on their compliance. Society is now facing the consequences of decades of messaging that framed men as disposable utilities rather than human beings with limits. When you remove appreciation, reciprocity, and respect, you should not be surprised when participation declines. This is not collapse caused by men leaving. This is exposure caused by men no longer buffering the impact of unstable systems. For generations, men absorbed pressure, solved problems quietly, and shielded others from consequences. As they step back, those consequences surface. That is why you are seeing confusion. That is why you are seeing frustration. That is why you are seeing demands disguised as concern. The safety net that men provided through labor, attention, protection, and provision is thinner now, and reality is showing up unfiltered. Men are not coming back to what they walked away from. They are building something else entirely. Lives structured around consent, clarity, and choice rather than obligation and expectation. This movement does not need a leader. It does not need a manifesto. It grows because it works for the people participating in it. And systems that fail to adapt to reality eventually fail entirely. Now, I want to be clear. Tough times are here. The 9 to 5 is history, and the creator economy is taking over. Join Angry's Creator Academy to learn how to build a thriving online business from scratch with minimal investment. Ditch the daily grind and flourish while others falter. Plus, sign up now and get our online business blueprint free. The Academy is linked in the description below. Go check it out now. This is not about hostility, it is about boundaries. It is not about resentment, it is about self respect. It is not about punishment, it is about withdrawal of participation. Men learned that attention is valuable, time is valuable, energy is valuable. Once you stop giving those things away without return, your life changes. The most revealing part of this entire shift is not that men left. It is how loudly some people react to their absence. When silence causes panic, it means presence was being taken for granted. And that is where we are now. Men are walking away, not because they were weak, but because they were strong enough to stop playing a losing game. They are choosing peace over conflict, stability over chaos, and reality over narrative. This is not a phase. This is not a trend. This is adaptation. And adaptation always favors those willing to see clearly. One of the biggest mistakes people make when trying to understand this shift is assuming that men left suddenly or emotionally. That is not what happened. Men left slowly, rationally, and with careful observation. This was not an explosion, it was erosion. Each experience added another data point. Each contradiction weakened trust. Each double standard chipped away at motivation. Eventually, the structure could no longer hold the weight placed on it. Men paid attention to how rules were applied. They noticed that accountability was selective and often symbolic. They noticed that outcomes mattered more than fairness. They noticed that intention was ignored when narrative convenience demanded otherwise. Over time, men learned that effort did not protect them, compliance did not shield them, and silence did not guarantee safety. When a system teaches that participation carries disproportionate risk, disengagement becomes logical behavior, not bitterness. Many men tried to communicate concerns early on. They raised questions about balance, respect, and fairness. Those concerns were dismissed, mocked, or reframed as weakness. When dialogue is punished, people stop speaking. When speaking stops working, people start leaving. Silence was not indifference. Silence was the final stage of learning. As men withdrew, something unexpected happened. Their stress levels dropped, their finances stabilized, their sleep improved, their sense of control returned. Without constant emotional turbulence, many men discovered that their baseline state was calm, focused, and capable. This realization was profound. Once a person experiences peace, it becomes very difficult to convince them that chaos is normal or necessary. Men also began comparing outcomes. They looked at peers who stayed engaged and peers who stepped away. The contrast was stark. Those who remained deeply invested often carried more anxiety, more financial strain, and more uncertainty. Those who disengaged appeared lighter, steadier, and more self directed. This comparison reinforced the decision to walk away. Another critical factor often ignored is how technology amplified consequences. Social media created environments where moments could be exaggerated, misinterpreted, or weaponized. Reputation became fragile. Context disappeared. Nuance was replaced with performance. Men learned that the safest interaction was no interaction at all. Not because men fear conversation, but because digital permanence punishes mistakes indefinitely. At the same time, cultural messaging celebrated exposure and confrontation without responsibility. Accusations carried social weight even when resolution did not follow. The cost of being wrong was often absorbed by the accused, regardless of outcome. Men observed this and adjusted accordingly. You do not step onto unstable ground when the fall has no safety net. This is why many men stopped approaching, stopped initiating, and stopped engaging. They were not confused, they were aware. They were not bitter, they were cautious. The narrative that men are afraid is incorrect. Men simply evaluated risk accurately. As more men stepped back, new conversations emerged asking why participation declined. Some framed it as a mystery, others framed it as entitlement. Very few framed it as consequence. Systems rarely examine their own design when users leave. They blame the users instead. The truth is simple. If a system punishes effort and rewards unpredictability, stable participants will exit. Men are not obligated to sustain systems that treat them as disposable inputs. No one is. Another uncomfortable truth is that many men discovered they could meet their emotional needs without romantic involvement. Friendship, purpose, structure, and self mastery replaced dependency. Men learned that validation from within is more reliable than validation from external approval. This shift reduced vulnerability to manipulation and pressure. When men stopped seeking approval, they stopped being controllable through shame. That is why shaming language no longer works the way it used to. You cannot shame someone who has already accepted themselves. You cannot threaten someone who has nothing to prove. This is also why attempts to reframe men walking away as a crisis often miss the mark. For the men who left, this is not a crisis, it is a solution. The distress exists outside the group that disengaged. That should tell you something important. Men did not abandon responsibility, they redirected it. They took responsibility for their own well being instead of absorbing responsibility for others who did not reciprocate. That distinction matters. Responsibility without authority or appreciation becomes exploitation. Men recognized that pattern and opted out. The economic implications of this shift are already visible. Fewer men are spending impulsively. Fewer men are financing lifestyles beyond their own. Fewer men are overextending to meet expectations that do not benefit them. This changes consumption patterns, housing decisions, and long term planning. Quiet choices have loud effects. Men are also investing differently. They are prioritizing security over display. They are learning skills, building reserves, and preparing for uncertainty rather than chasing social validation. This is not retreat. This is recalibration. The narrative that men owe participation is rooted in outdated assumptions. Participation must be voluntary to be sustainable. When obligation replaces choice, motivation collapses. Men learned this lesson early and applied it decisively. It is important to address another misconception. Men walking away are not anti relationship, they are anti imbalance. They are not against companionship, they are against asymmetry. They are not rejecting connection, they are rejecting risk without reward. This distinction matters because it explains why many men remain open to interactions that are respectful, reciprocal, and stable. What they refuse is chaos framed as passion, entitlement framed as confidence, and instability framed as empowerment. Men are not confused about what they want. They want peace, respect, and predictability. They want clarity instead of constant negotiation. They want honesty instead of performance. When those conditions are absent, walking away is not a loss, it is preservation. As society grapples with this shift, responses have varied. Some acknowledge that change is needed, others double down on denial. Historically, denial delays adaptation. Systems that refuse to evolve lose relevance. This is not ideological, it is structural. Men walking away does not mean men disappearing. It means men choosing where and how they engage. It means selective participation. It means consent driven involvement rather than default obligation. There is also a generational component. Younger men are observing outcomes earlier and adjusting sooner. They are learning from older peers. They are analyzing patterns rather than repeating mistakes. This accelerates the shift. Younger men are also less susceptible to social pressure that demands sacrifice without return. They grew up watching consequences unfold publicly. They are not idealistic about systems that failed visibly. They value transparency and autonomy more than tradition. This does not mean younger men lack values. It means they prioritize different ones: stability over approval, independence over expectation, reality over narrative. The silence surrounding men walking away is deliberate in some spaces. It is easier to blame than to reflect. Reflection requires acknowledging that certain strategies failed. Blame allows preservation of ideology without modification. But observable reality does not care about ideology, it responds to incentives. When incentives disappear, participation follows. Men did not create this situation alone. Cultural feedback loops did, legal structures did, social reinforcement did, media framing did. Each contributed a piece. Men simply responded to the environment as it existed. Responsibility is not about assigning guilt, it is about understanding cause and effect. Without that understanding, no meaningful change occurs. One of the most revealing developments has been how quickly concern turns into demand. When men do not respond to concern, pressure escalates. When pressure fails, resentment appears. This progression exposes motivation. If concern were genuine, introspection would follow. Instead, entitlement surfaces. Men walking away disrupted expectations that were never negotiated fairly. That disruption feels uncomfortable. Those who benefited from the previous arrangement. Discomfort is not injustice, it is adjustment. The future will not be shaped by arguments about who is right, it will be shaped by behavior. Men have already voted with their actions. That vote is ongoing and cumulative. Re engagement, if it happens at all, will require structural change, not rhetoric. Respect cannot be demanded. Reciprocity cannot be negotiated under threat. Trust cannot be rebuilt without accountability. Men are not asking for perfection. They are asking for balance. They are asking for fairness. They are asking for clarity. These are reasonable requests in any system. Until those conditions exist, men will continue to choose paths that offer them peace, autonomy, and security. They will continue to invest in themselves. They will continue to walk away quietly and confidently. And the most important thing to understand is this: walking away is not a statement. It is a lifestyle adjustment. It is not aimed at anyone. It is chosen for oneself. And that is why it is so powerful. Men did not need permission to leave, they only needed clarity. Once clarity arrived, the decision made itself. And clarity has a way of spreading. To understand where this is going, you have to understand where it started. This did not begin as a movement. It began as individual men noticing that something felt off, small moments that did not add up, conversations that felt scripted, expectations that were high but one sided, consequences that appeared suddenly and without proportionality. Over time, these moments form patterns, and patterns form conclusions. For a long time, men were told that persistence was virtuous. If something did not work, they were told to try harder. If a relationship failed, they were told to reflect more. If expectations felt unfair, they were told to communicate better. And many men did exactly that. They read books, they attended workshops, they internalized criticism, they adjusted behavior, they softened language, they monitored tone. They questioned themselves constantly. And what they noticed eventually was that self improvement did not lead to mutual improvement, it led to increased expectations. Each adjustment was treated not as growth, but as a new baseline. Effort was not rewarded, it was absorbed and forgotten. When effort becomes invisible, motivation erodes. At the same time, accountability became abstract. Responsibility was framed emotionally rather than behaviorally. Outcomes mattered less than feelings. Consistency mattered less than narrative alignment. Men learned that logic was often dismissed as cold, while emotional reactions were treated as unquestionable truths. This imbalance made resolution impossible. You cannot resolve a conflict when standards change mid conversation. Men began to understand that they were operating under asymmetric rules. Their mistakes were permanent, their intentions were irrelevant, their history could be rewritten based on the present narrative. In contrast, instability elsewhere was often reframed as growth, empowerment, or expression. This double standard did not need explanation, it was visible. This is where trust collapsed. Trust is built on predictability. When consequences are unpredictable, people disengage. Men realized that no amount of goodwill could guarantee safety in an environment where interpretation outweighed intent. When trust collapses, participation becomes a liability. Many men stayed longer than they should have because of hope. Hope that communication would work. Hope that fairness would return. Hope that balance would be restored. Eventually, hope gave way to realism. Realism does not shout, it simply leaves. One of the most overlooked elements of this shift is fatigue, emotional fatigue, cognitive fatigue, decision fatigue. Men were constantly expected to read signals, anticipate reactions, and self correct in advance. This level of vigilance is not sustainable. When exhaustion sets in, withdrawal becomes the only recovery option. Once men withdrew, something important happened. Their internal dialogue changed. Instead of questioning themselves constantly, they began trusting their judgment again. Instead of anticipating conflict, they planned for stability. Instead of seeking approval, they built self respect. That internal shift is irreversible. This is why attempts to shame men back into participation fail. Shame only works on those who seek validation from the source applying it. Men who walked away no longer do. That dynamic has ended. Another reason reversal attempts fail is because they misunderstand motivation. Men did not leave to make a point, they left to make their lives better. That distinction matters. You cannot negotiate someone out of peace, you cannot argue someone out of clarity. Society often assumes that men are driven primarily by external reward, status, approval, recognition. That assumption is outdated. Modern men are increasingly driven by internal metrics: calm, control, consistency. These metrics cannot be manipulated externally. When men optimized for internal stability, they stopped responding to external pressure. This is why messaging that relies on guilt or obligation feels hollow. It speaks to a version of men that no longer exists. There is also a structural reality that many do not want to acknowledge. Men walking away reduces competition in certain spaces while increasing competition in others. It changes leverage dynamics. It shifts bargaining power. It alters incentives. These shifts are destabilizing for systems that relied on predictable male participation. Dating markets, for example, were built on the assumption that men would pursue at scale. When that pursuit slows, the entire structure changes. Scarcity shifts, expectations shift, outcomes shift. Instead of adapting, many voices attempt to restore the previous dynamic through pressure rather than reform. Pressure without reform does not work. Another area impacted is labor and productivity. Men are reassessing where their effort goes. They are less willing to sacrifice personal well being for institutions that offer no loyalty. They prioritize flexibility, autonomy, and exit options. This changes how work is valued and structured. Men are also redefining success. Success is no longer measured solely by accumulation or status, it is measured by sustainability. Can this lifestyle be maintained without burnout? Can this pace be sustained without resentment? Can the structure support long term peace? If the answer is no, men adjust. This adjustment is not dramatic, it is subtle. It shows up in smaller homes, fewer commitments, simpler routines. It shows up in boundaries that are enforced quietly. It shows up in choices that look boring but feel stable. This is where many misunderstand men walking away. They expect anger, they expect bitterness. What they find instead is indifference. Indifference is far more disruptive than anger. Anger seeks engagement. Indifference does not. When men stop reacting, systems lose leverage. Reaction feeds cycles. Indifference starves them. That is why this shift feels unsettling. There's nothing to push against it. Men are not trying to change society through confrontation. They are changing it through absence. Absence reveals dependency. Absence exposes imbalance. Absence forces adaptation or collapse. It is important to address the claim that men walking away harms society. That claim assumes that men owe participation regardless of conditions. That assumption has always been flawed. Participation must be earned through fairness. It cannot be demanded indefinitely. Society functions best when contributions are voluntary and valued. When contributions are coerced or devalued, contributors leave. This is not gender specific, it is human behavior. Men walking away is not a threat, it is feedback. Ignoring feedback does not make it disappear, it compounds consequences. There is also an emotional component that deserves attention. Many men experienced grief during this transition, grief for expectations that never materialized, grief for effort that went unrecognized, grief for futures that were promised but never delivered. Walking away was not always easy, it was necessary. Once grief passed, acceptance followed. Acceptance brought relief. Relief brought clarity. Clarity brought peace. That progression matters. You cannot pull someone back into grief once they have reached peace. The idea that men will eventually return out of loneliness misunderstands male psychology. Men do not fear solitude the way they fear chaos. Solitude can be structured, chaos cannot. Men will choose solitude over instability every time. This is why calls to return to dating, to restore norms, to rebuild participation fall flat. They offer nostalgia without reform. They offer obligation without incentive. They offer guilt without accountability. If society wants men to re engage, it must first acknowledge why they disengaged. That requires honesty, not slogans, not blame, not denial, honest assessment. That assessment would include acknowledging that some systems rewarded conflict over cooperation, that some narratives encouraged entitlement over reciprocity, that some legal structures incentivized extraction over resolution, that some cultural messages devalued masculinity while demanding its benefits. Acknowledgement is not admission of guilt, it is recognition of reality. Without recognition, nothing changes. Men are not waiting for apologies, they are waiting for evidence. Evidence that balance exists, evidence that fairness is enforced, evidence that participation does not require self sacrifice without return. Until that evidence appears, men will continue to build parallel lives, lives that do not depend on unstable dynamics, lives that prioritize internal alignment over external validation. These lives may not look impressive on social media, they may not generate applause, but they function. And functionality matters more than optics. As more men adopt this approach, it normalizes. What was once framed as avoidance becomes recognized as discernment. What was once criticized as selfish becomes understood as self preservation. Cultural shifts do not announce themselves, they unfold. By the time they are named, they are already established. We are in the middle of one now. Men walking away is not the end of something, it is the beginning of something different, a recalibration of values, a redefinition of engagement, a restructuring of priorities. Whether society adapts or resists will determine how disruptive this becomes. Adaptation requires humility. Resistance requires force. Force rarely works long term. Men have already adapted. The question is who follows. Take a moment to consider what stability actually looks like, not in theory, in practice. Look at who is calm. Look at who is building quietly. Look at who is not demanding attention or validation. Those are the people who figured something out early. When institutions refuse to adapt, they do not fail quietly. They become louder, more insistent, and more rigid. This is the phase we are entering now. Instead of asking what went wrong, many systems are trying to reassert control through messaging, pressure, and moral framing. The goal is not understanding, the goal is compliance, and compliance without trust does not last. Historically, when participation declines, institutions have two options. They can adjust incentives or they can escalate pressure. Adjustment requires humility. Pressure requires authority. When authority is questioned or ignored, pressure turns into noise. Noise does not rebuild trust, it accelerates withdrawal. This is why the conversation has shifted from curiosity to accusation. When men first disengaged, the response was confusion. When confusion did not bring them back, frustration followed. Now frustration is hardening into blame. Blame is the final stage before irrelevance. The escalation follows a predictable pattern. First, concern is expressed, then responsibility is assigned, then obligation is implied. Finally, non participation is framed as moral failure. This pattern reveals intent. If participation were truly voluntary, refusal would be accepted. When refusal is condemned, voluntariness was never real. Men see this clearly. They recognize when language shifts from invitation to demand. They recognize when concern is conditional on obedience. That recognition reinforces their decision to stay disengaged. Another critical point often overlooked is that many men did not leave loudly because they did not want conflict. They left quietly because they wanted peace. Quiet exit is not weakness, it is strategy. When someone leaves without drama, they deny the system the reaction it feeds on. This quiet exit is deeply destabilizing to systems that rely on constant engagement. Engagement fuels relevance, absence drains it. The more men disengage calmly, the more exposed the imbalance becomes. There is also a growing realization among men that no explanation will be accepted unless it aligns with existing narratives. Explaining disengagement invites debate. Debate invites distortion. Distortion invites conflict. Men chose a simpler path. They stopped explaining and started living. That choice frustrates those who want dialogue only as a means of persuasion rather than understanding. Dialogue that exists solely to convince is not dialogue. It is negotiation under pressure. Men opted out of that as well. As pressure escalates, narratives become more extreme. Men are described as avoidant, emotionally unavailable, or unwilling to grow. These labels are designed to provoke response. They fail because men no longer identify with them. Labels only wound when they hit something that still seeks approval. This is another reason the shift is irreversible. Men are no longer asking to be understood. They are not seeking validation from systems that dismissed their concerns for decades. They are building lives where understanding is internal rather than negotiated. Institutions often miscalculate by assuming silence means confusion. Silence can also mean resolution. Men resolved the conflict internally and moved on. There is nothing left to argue. The attempt to restore previous dynamics without structural reform is similar to trying to restart a machine without fixing the broken part. It may run briefly, but it will fail again. Men are not interested in temporary fixes, they are interested in sustainable environments. This brings us to long term consequences. When a large group disengages, ripple effects follow, not immediately but steadily. Social patterns shift, economic assumptions change, cultural expectations recalibrate. The effects are subtle at first, then unmistakable. And one consequence is a reduction in tolerance for dysfunction. Men who built stable internal systems are less willing to re enter unstable external ones. This raises the baseline expectation for any future engagement. Stability is no longer optional, it is required. Another consequence is that men become more selective with their time and energy. They no longer overcommit, they no longer rescue situations they did not create, they no longer absorb stress for the sake of harmony. This changes interpersonal dynamics across the board. There is also an increase in parallel structures. Men are forming communities, routines, and support systems that do not rely on traditional frameworks. These structures are smaller, quieter, and more resilient. They are not designed to impress. They are designed to function. As these structures grow, reliance on unstable systems decreases. When reliance decreases, leverage disappears. Systems that once assumed participation now face competition from alternatives. This is how change actually happens, not through confrontation, but through replacement. The narrative that men walking away will eventually return because society needs them misunderstands the direction of dependence. Men learned they do not need systems that undermine them. Systems that relied on men are the ones facing pressure. That pressure will not be resolved through rhetoric, it will only be resolved through reform. Reform requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths. That is the step many are trying to skip. Another consequence is generational learning. Younger men are not entering these systems blindly, they are observing outcomes. They are seeing who thrives and who struggles. They are adjusting early. This shortens the learning curve dramatically. When behavior changes at the entry point, the entire system feels it. Recruitment slows, expectations shift, norms erode. This is already happening. There's also a psychological shift worth noting. Men are less reactive, they are less easily provoked, they are less invested in winning arguments. This emotional detachment is often misinterpreted as apathy. It is not, it is focus. Focus on self maintenance rather than external approval. Focus on sustainability rather than performance. Focus on reality rather than narrative. And this focus makes men difficult to manipulate. Manipulation relies on emotional hooks. Men who have disengaged remove those hooks intentionally. The idea that men are abandoning responsibility is incorrect. They are redefining responsibility. Responsibility now means taking care of oneself first, so that any engagement is chosen, not coerced. That redefinition is healthy. Healthy systems do not require sacrifice without return. They encourage balance. They reward contribution. They respect boundaries. Men walking away are not rejecting responsibility, they are rejecting imbalance. As pressure continues, some institutions will adapt, others will collapse. Collapse does not always look dramatic. It often looks like irrelevance, fewer participants, lower engagement, reduced trust, gradual decline. Adaptation, on the other hand, requires listening without defensiveness. It requires structural changes that restore fairness. It requires accountability applied consistently. It requires respect for boundaries. Whether adaptation happens depends on whether those in power value sustainability over control. Control feels satisfying short term. Sustainability lasts. Men are not waiting for permission to live stable lives. They already are. The question is whether systems will adjust to reality or continue demanding allegiance they no longer command. The most important thing to understand is that this shift is not driven by ideology, it is driven by experience. Experience is stubborn. It does not disappear when challenged. It only changes when conditions change. Men did not coordinate this. They independently reached similar conclusions because they observed similar patterns. That convergence should be taken seriously. When millions of individuals make the same adjustment independently, it signals a structural issue, not a personal failing. This is why dismissing men walking away as a fringe movement is a mistake. It is not fringe, it is widespread, it is simply quiet. Quiet does not mean insignificant, it means resolved. As we move forward, attempts to shame, pressure, or guilt men into returning will continue. They will continue to fail. Not because men are stubborn, but because men are clear. Clarity is the most dangerous thing to a system built on confusion. Men who have clarity will not trade it for promises. They will not exchange peace for nostalgia. They will not sacrifice stability for approval. The path forward, if there is one, requires mutual respect. Not symbolic respect, practical respect. Respect that shows up in policy, behavior, and accountability. Until then, men will continue to choose what works for them. They will continue to walk away from what does not. This is not abandonment. It is alignment. Alignment with reality, alignment with self interest, alignment with peace, and alignment always wins in the long run. If reform were taken seriously, it would begin with honesty rather than optics. Real reform does not start with slogans or campaigns. It starts with admitting that some incentives produce outcomes no one is willing to own publicly. It starts with acknowledging that certain systems rewarded instability while penalizing stability, that some narratives elevated feelings over facts, and that accountability was often applied unevenly. Without that admission, any proposed change is cosmetic. Men are not fooled by surface level gestures. They recognize symbolic action immediately. When language shifts, but behavior does not, trust erodes further. Men learned this lesson repeatedly. Promises were made, messaging evolved, outcomes stayed the same. That pattern trained men to stop listening and start observing instead. Observation is what led to walking away in the first place. Meaningful reform would require restoring predictability. Predictability in social consequences, predictability in legal outcomes, predictability in expectations. Men do not need guarantees of success, they need guarantees of fairness. Without fairness, effort becomes irrational. Another element of reform would involve reestablishing reciprocity. Reciprocity does not mean identical contribution. It means proportional responsibility. It means effort in both directions. It means appreciation that is demonstrated rather than declared. When reciprocity disappears, relationships become extraction mechanisms rather than partnerships. Men noticed when appreciation became performative. They noticed when gratitude was spoken but not practiced. They noticed when contribution was expected but never reciprocated. Over time, they stopped offering what was taken for granted. Reform would also require redefining empowerment in a way that does not rely on externalizing cost. Empowerment that depends on someone else absorbing consequences is not empowerment, it is displacement. Men recognize this dynamic early and refuse to continue participating in it. Another necessary change would involve restoring respect for boundaries. Boundaries are not barriers, they are agreements. When boundaries are dismissed as insecurity or hostility, people stop expressing them. When people stop expressing boundaries, they leave instead. Men walking away is what boundary enforcement looks like when communication fails. A balanced system would also value restraint as much as expression. Modern narratives often celebrate unfiltered expression while treating restraint as repression. Men learned that restraint protected them. It reduced risk, it preserved peace. Any system that punishes restraint will lose those who practice it. Reform would also require disentangling validation from conflict. Too many systems reward escalation rather than resolution. Attention flows to disruption. Calm consistency is ignored. Men learned that calm behavior was not rewarded. So they removed themselves from environments that fed on instability. If you want stable participants, you must reward stable behavior. Another overlooked aspect of reform is how masculinity is framed. Masculinity was often treated as something to be corrected rather than understood. Strength was framed as threat. Assertiveness was framed as danger. Self reliance was framed as detachment. Men internalized the message that their natural inclinations were liabilities. Then society turned around and asked where the providers, protectors, and builders went. You cannot devalue traits and then demand their benefits. Men recognized this contradiction and exited the exchange. True reform would involve integrating masculinity rather than policing it. It would recognize that structure, discipline, and restraint are stabilizing forces. Men walking away rediscovered those qualities internally. They are unlikely to surrender them again to systems that undermine them. There is also the issue of responsibility without authority. Men were often expected to absorb responsibility for outcomes they could not influence. That dynamic breeds resentment and disengagement. Responsibility must be paired with agency. Without agency, responsibility is punishment. Men walking away reclaimed agency by removing themselves from situations where responsibility was imposed without control. Any meaningful attempt to re engage men would need to address that imbalance directly. Another point worth addressing is the idea that men are obligated to fix what they did not break. This expectation appears frequently in discourse. It assumes that men must repair systems that penalize them simply because they have the capacity to do so. Capacity does not equal obligation. Men are no longer accepting that equation. Responsibility chosen freely is sustainable. Responsibility imposed indefinitely is not. The reason surface level reforms fail is because they do not change lived experience. Men do not respond to messaging, they respond to outcomes. When outcomes remain unchanged, behavior remains unchanged. This brings us to the reality many are avoiding. Men walking away is already the new normal for a growing segment of the population. It does not require validation, it does not require agreement. It exists because it works. The longer reform is delayed, the more entrenched this adjustment becomes. Habits solidify, lifestyles stabilize, alternatives strengthen. At some point, return is no longer attractive, even if conditions improve slightly. And this is another miscalculation many make. They assume men are waiting. They are not. They are building, and they are building routines that do not revolve around constant negotiation. They are building financial buffers that reduce dependence. They are building identities that are internally anchored. These structures make men resilient to pressure. Resilience is often misunderstood. It is not stubbornness, it is independence. Independent people are difficult to coerce. That is why pressure escalates when independence spreads. Another consequence of men walking away is the recalibration of expectations across society. When men stop overextending, others must adjust. Some adapt, others struggle. That struggle is often reframed as injustice rather than consequence. But consequence is not cruelty, it is feedback. For decades, men buffered the impact of unstable systems by absorbing cost quietly. As they step back, those costs surface. The exposure feels harsh only because it was delayed. This does not mean men want anyone to suffer. It means they are no longer willing to suffer silently to prevent discomfort elsewhere. There is a difference. The idea that men owe sacrifice indefinitely is rooted in outdated thinking. Sacrifice without recognition becomes exploitation. Men recognize that and opted out. As more men choose this path, it influences cultural expectations. Younger men see alternatives. They see that peace is possible. They see that fulfillment does not require constant compromise. That visibility accelerates adoption. This is why attempts to shame younger men are especially ineffective. They have already seen the outcomes. They are not motivated by abstract ideals, they are motivated by observable results. Men walking away is often described as avoidance. In reality, it is prioritization, prioritization of mental clarity, prioritization of financial stability, prioritization of autonomy. Avoidance runs from fear. Prioritization runs toward value. Men know the difference. And another aspect that deserves attention is how men redefined connection. Walking away does not mean isolation. Many men maintain friendships, mentorships, and communities built on mutual respect. These connections are lower conflict and higher trust. That comparison reinforces the decision to disengage from unstable dynamics. Men did not become antisocial. They became selective, and selectivity is often misinterpreted by systems that relied on abundance. When abundance disappears, quality becomes visible. That shift can be uncomfortable for those accustomed to unconditional access. The long term outcome of this shift depends on adaptation. Systems that reform meaningfully may regain some participation. Systems that resist will continue to lose relevance. This is not punishment, it is evolution. Evolution does not care about intention, it responds to environment. Men adapted to the environment they were placed in. If the environment changes, behavior may follow. Until then, men will continue choosing what aligns with their well being. The most telling sign of where this is headed is not what is said publicly, but what is chosen privately. Men are choosing stability over performance, quiet over noise, peace over validation. Those choices accumulate, and eventually, narratives must align with reality or be replaced by it. We are approaching that point now when adaptation finally becomes unavoidable. It rarely arrives gently. Systems do not change because they are asked nicely, they change because reality removes alternatives. What we are seeing now is the early stage of that removal. Participation is no longer automatic, compliance is no longer assumed, engagement is no longer guaranteed. That changes everything. Power has always depended on participation, not force, not authority, not messaging. Participation. When people choose to show up, systems function. When they do not, systems weaken regardless of how loud they become. Men walking away expose this dependency quietly. And that exposure is what makes the moment so tense. The most important shift is not that men left, but that they learned they could leave. That realization changes leverage permanently. Once someone knows exit is possible and survivable, pressure loses effectiveness. Threats lose meaning, demands lose teeth. And this is why so many narratives now focus on persuading men that leaving is somehow harmful to themselves. That framing is revealing. If leaving truly harmed men, no persuasion would be needed. Reality would do the work. But reality did the opposite. It rewarded departure with calm, clarity, and control. And men are not responding to arguments because they already ran the experiment. They tested engagement, they tested compliance, they tested patience, then they tested withdrawal. The results spoke clearly. Once results are known, debate becomes irrelevant. When participation becomes voluntary instead of assumed, systems must compete. They must offer value. They must reduce risk. They must become attractive rather than obligatory. That transition is difficult for systems built on entitlement to labor, attention, or sacrifice. Competition forces accountability. Accountability forces reform. Reform threatens entrenched interests. This is why resistance is so intense. Men who walked away early gained something else that is often overlooked: time. Time to think without pressure, time to plan without distraction, time to recover without interruption. Time is the one resource that cannot be reclaimed once lost. Those who protected it early are positioned differently now. With time comes foresight. With foresight comes preparation. Men who step back early are not scrambling. They are observing. They are adjusting. They are not reacting emotionally to headlines or narratives. They are making measured decisions. This is why attempts to provoke emotional response fail. Emotional hooks no longer land. Men are operating from a place of internal alignment rather than external stimulation. That is a powerful position. As participation declines, institutions will attempt reforms that appear significant but change little. These efforts will be framed as progress. Men will evaluate them by outcome, not intention. If outcomes do not improve materially, behavior will not change. This outcome based evaluation is another irreversible shift. Men stopped giving credit for effort alone. They demand results. That mindset spreads quickly once adopted. Another unavoidable consequence of voluntary participation is redistribution of responsibility. When men stop absorbing excess responsibility, others must carry it. This exposes inefficiencies that were previously hidden. Exposure creates discomfort. Discomfort often produces blame rather than adjustment. But blame does not restore participation, it accelerates disengagement. The men who walked away early are often described as detached. That description misses the point. Detachment is not disengagement from reality, it is disengagement from unnecessary conflict. It allows clearer thinking. Clear thinking leads to better outcomes. Those men are not frozen, they are fluid, they adapt without panic, they change direction without drama, they are not anchored to narratives that no longer serve them. As systems strain, you will see increased attempts to redefine success and failure. Language will shift, standards will blur, responsibility will be reframed. These are coping mechanisms, not solutions. Men will recognize them instantly because they already learned to distinguish language from reality. The next phase will involve attempts to moralize participation. Participation will be framed as virtue. Withdrawal will be framed as defect. This strategy relies on guilt. Guilt requires emotional dependence. Men who walked away remove that dependency. Moral framing only works on those who still seek approval from the source applying it. Men no longer do. This is why future attempts to reverse the shift will rely less on persuasion and more on structural pressure. Policies, incentives, and constraints will be adjusted to encourage compliance. Some will work temporarily, many will backfire. Pressure creates short term compliance at the cost of long term trust. Men already learned that trade off. They will respond by further optimizing for autonomy. The men best positioned for what comes next are not the loudest or most ideological. They are the most adaptable. They are the ones who already simplified their lives, reduced dependencies, built buffers, learned to live well without external validation. These men are not immune to change, they are prepared for it. Preparation does not look dramatic, it looks boring. It looks like savings instead of spending. It looks like skills instead of credentials. It looks like routine instead of chaos. It looks like boundaries enforced quietly. Boring scales. Drama collapses. As instability increases in systems that resist reform, the contrast becomes sharper. Men who chose peace will appear increasingly grounded compared to environments that thrive on constant friction. That contrast draws others quietly. This is how movements spread without organizing. People notice what works. The idea that men walking away is selfish collapses under scrutiny. Selfishness extracts value without contribution. Men walking away are withdrawing contribution from environments that devalued it. That is not selfishness. It is consent. Consent applies to participation just as much as it applies anywhere else. Men exercised it. Another claim often made is that men walking away will regret it later. That claim assumes regret is inevitable. Regret follows poor outcomes. Men are evaluating outcomes daily. If regret were present, behavior would change. It has not. Instead, satisfaction increases. Not euphoric happiness, but steady contentment. That is harder to manipulate. Contentment is not flashy. It does not generate clicks. It does not need validation. It simply exists. This creates a problem for systems that rely on dissatisfaction to drive engagement. Dissatisfied people are easier to motivate. Content people are not. As contentment spreads, engagement drops further. This creates a feedback loop. Less engagement leads to more aggressive messaging. More aggressive messaging drives more withdrawal. At some point, adaptation becomes unavoidable. Either systems reform genuinely or they shrink into irrelevance. Reform, if it happens, will not come from debate. It will come from necessity. It will come when the cost of not changing exceeds the cost of change. Men walking away increases that cost steadily. Those who walked away early will not rush back. They will observe reforms cautiously. They will test outcomes slowly. Trust, once broken, rebuilds at a measured pace. Trust requires consistency over time, not gestures, not promises, not campaigns, consistency. Until consistency is proven, men will maintain distance. This distance is not hostility, it is prudence. Prudence is often mistaken for fear. It is not. It is wisdom gained through experience. The men who learned early that stability matters more than approval will carry that lesson forward, regardless of external change. Even if conditions improve, their priorities will remain altered. This is why the shift feels permanent. It is not tied to a single issue. It is a change in orientation towards self-governance rather than external governance, orientation toward internal metrics rather than social metrics, orientation toward sustainability rather than spectacle. These orientations rarely reverse once adopted. As the future unfolds, there will be attempts to rewrite the history of this shift, to reframe it as misunderstanding or miscommunication. Men will remember differently. They lived it. Memory grounded in experience resists revision. The final consequence worth addressing is legitimacy. Systems derive legitimacy from voluntary participation. When participation declines, legitimacy erodes. Authority without legitimacy relies on force. Force is expensive and unstable. Legitimacy can be restored only through reform that benefits participants. Men are not demanding special treatment, they are demanding fair treatment. Fairness is the lowest sustainable standard. Anything less fails. Men walking away did not lower standards, they raised them. Raised standards force systems to improve or lose relevance. This is the moment we are in now. The men who walked away early are not waiting for permission. They are already living the future others are still debating. They are not angry. They are not resentful. They are not lost. They are aligned. Aligned with reality. Aligned with self-interest. Aligned with peace. And alignment is powerful because it does not need reinforcement. When a generation grows up seeing withdrawal as a valid option rather than a last resort, culture changes quietly but permanently. This is one of the most underestimated consequences of what is happening now. Young men are not being taught to endure imbalance as a rite of passage. They are being taught, often indirectly, that opting out is acceptable when conditions are unreasonable. That lesson will shape behavior for decades. Previous generations were socialized to endure. to tolerate instability, to sacrifice first and ask questions later. That social conditioning no longer holds the same power. Younger men watched what endurance produced. They saw the cost. They saw the outcomes. They adjusted accordingly. This does not mean they lack commitment. It means they are selective about where commitment is placed. Commitment without boundaries is no longer viewed as noble. It is viewed as naive. That shift alone changes everything. Cultural systems rely heavily on assumptions passed down unquestioned. When those assumptions are interrupted, momentum stalls. One of the strongest assumptions was that men would always adapt no matter the cost. That assumption is now broken. And what replaces it is a culture of consent driven participation, participation based on clear benefit rather than obligation, engagement chosen deliberately rather than inherited automatically. This change frustrates institutions built on predictability. Predictability allowed planning without negotiation. When participation becomes conditional, planning requires compromise. Compromise requires humility. Humility is difficult for systems accustomed to authority. That is why nostalgia has become such a common rhetorical tool. Nostalgia simplifies the past, it removes context. It frames earlier eras as stable without acknowledging the hidden costs that were absorbed quietly. Men today are not moved by nostalgia because they saw those costs clearly. Nostalgia also fails because it offers memory without reform. It asks people to return to arrangements that no longer make sense. Men are not interested in recreating systems that produced dissatisfaction simply because they are familiar. The future is not being built by those demanding return. It is being built by those designing alternatives. These alternatives are not utopian. They are practical. Smaller social circles, lower exposure to risk, clearer expectations, reduced dependency, greater emphasis on personal sovereignty. Sovereignty is a word often misunderstood. It does not mean isolation. It means self-governance. It means choosing how, when, and where to engage rather than being swept into participation by default. Men walking away reclaimed sovereignty over their time, energy, and attention. Once reclaimed, it is rarely surrendered again. This is why attempts to frame withdrawal as immaturity miss the mark. Immaturity seeks escape without responsibility. What men chose was responsibility for themselves. That is the opposite of immaturity. Another misunderstanding is the belief that men will eventually be forced back by necessity. That assumption underestimates adaptability. Men adjusted consumption, they adjusted lifestyle, they adjusted expectations, they reduced needs rather than increasing dependency. Reducing needs is a powerful form of leverage. The less you require from unstable systems, the freer you become. Men learned this early and applied it widely, and as this mindset spreads, systems that rely on constant demand face a shrinking base. Shrinking bases produce louder messaging. Louder messaging produces more skepticism. Skepticism accelerates withdrawal. This feedback loop is already visible. The most telling sign that the shift is permanent is how unbothered many men appear. They are not campaigning. They are not arguing. They are not trying to convince anyone. They are simply living differently. That quiet confidence is difficult to counter. You cannot debate someone who is content. You cannot pressure someone who does not need what you offer. Contentment is disruptive because it exposes unnecessary complexity. When someone thrives with less drama, less validation, and fewer demands, it raises uncomfortable questions for those still trapped in cycles of dissatisfaction. This is why men walking away triggers strong reactions. It is not because they are causing harm. It is because they are refusing to absorb harm. Refusal forces redistribution. Redistribution forces Accountability. Accountability forces change or collapse. This brings us to the long view. In the long term, cultures that fail to adapt to voluntary participation lose relevance. They may persist structurally, but participation dwindles. Engagement becomes performative. Trust erodes. Eventually, alternatives replace them. Alternatives do not need to be perfect. They only need to function better than what they replace. Men walking away created functional alternatives quietly. Personal stability replaced social chaos. Internal validation replaced external approval. Predictable routines replaced emotional volatility. These alternatives do not seek dominance, they simply exist. Existence is enough. If reform ever arrives in a meaningful way, it will be tested carefully. Men will not rush back. They will observe patterns. They will evaluate consistency. They will prioritize outcomes over promises. Trust rebuilt slowly is trust that lasts. Men learned the value of patience the hard way. They will apply it now. If reform does not arrive, men will continue doing what they are already doing, building lives that require less explanation and fewer compromises, lives that function regardless of external approval. This is why fear based predictions about men walking away collapse under scrutiny. Fear assumes desperation. Desperation is absent. What exists instead is clarity. Clarity about what works. Clarity about what does not. Clarity about personal limits. Limits are not weaknesses. They are design parameters. Systems that ignore them fail. Individuals who respect them thrive. Men respected their limits and adjusted accordingly. This adjustment did not come from ideology, it came from lived experience. Lived experience is the most persuasive teacher there is. Attempts to rewrite that experience through narrative will fail. Experience anchors memory. Memory informs behavior. The future belongs to those who align behavior with reality rather than forcing reality to conform to narrative. Men walking away aligned early. And as we close this discussion, it is important to understand that this is not about winning an argument. It is about recognizing a shift that already happened. Whether it is acknowledged publicly or not, does not change its impact. Men are not returning to arrangements that require them to disappear emotionally, financially, or psychologically in exchange for participation. They are not returning to systems that penalize stability and reward volatility. They are not returning to narratives that dismiss their boundaries while demanding their contributions. They are moving forward. Moving forward does not require consensus, it requires conviction. Conviction grounded in observation, observation grounded in reality. That is what we are witnessing now. Men walking away did not create instability. They revealed it. They removed the buffer that concealed it. What remains must now stand on its own. Whether it can will determine what comes next. Before we end, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed here? Do you agree with it? Do you see these patterns in your own life or in the world around you? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because these conversations matter. And as always, like the video if you like it, don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, Men Walking Away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.